we are in session 7. Man, 8 weeks. This is an 8-week session. It was long, but at the same time, the Christian history is really long because it could have been easily 24 or 50 or I don't know. We do. And it's actually a big session. I'll touch upon a little bit of feminist theology, explaining what it is and some of the approaches of it. But next week, Bill's going to be leading the class specifically on liberation theology, which kind of comes, again, I'll give sort of like the timeline and the movements that kind of led to some of these theologies. Although, again, when you dive into the theology, it actually has always existed. It just becomes something that is more focused and forefront. So last week, I kind of went through like 3 centuries from, what did I cover last week? I started with Calvin with Reformation in the 1600s, or 1500s, 16th century, and kind of talked about the Reformation movement, the reforms happening within the church, not only the Protestant movement, the Reformed traditions, but also the reform happening in England. Then, leading up to the wave of Puritans that came to America. I'm just quickly touching upon those final parts, leading up to today. We're going to be talking about the social gospel movement, leading into some of these other developments of theology that we'll be talking about today and next week. So again, the Great American Movement happened around 1730 to 1740, which was, again, early part of the...
This on the web.
So according to Siri, the Great Awakening history, the Great Awakening was a religious revival that impacted the religious English colonies in America during the 1730s and 1740s. Hey, I got it pretty good.
Siri's keeping up with you.
There you go. All right. She just verified what he just saying. All right. Okay, so... Yeah, and so during this time, again, the Puritans had come, about 10 or 20 years before that, and the Puritans, again, were those who were dissatisfied with the church establishment in primarily England, the Church of England, the way it was going, and of course, prior to that, the church was going back and forth, right? And all of this time, the great debate or the conflict was between whether the theologies of the Catholic Church and then the Protestant Reformation movement, and of course England went back and forth. During that time, of course, the Puritans in not only England but also Scotland and Great Britain were those who were very unhappy with the changes that were happening. And so they left, and the more extreme Puritans, and they were called Puritans because they wanted a more pure practice of faith, religion, than what they felt these established churches were being tainted or what's another word for tainted? Sort of like influenced by too much politics. There's too much politics, right? And so we can understand that, I guess. Anyhow, so they're called the Puritans because they wanted that pure form, and then the more extreme Puritans were called separatists because they wanted to separate. They're like, okay, enough of this. If there's no hope for the church, and they would separate, from the church. And so, like the first group, left, and then traveled to America, and they were known as the Pilgrims, right? And in the decades that followed, there were more Puritans, which were a bit more moderate in their theology, or they didn't really want to separate from England, but they kind of dreamt that they would come to America and establish a a model of the church and society in which when time came for England and Europe to reform, that the model in America would be that perfect model. That never happened. But during that time, the Great Awakening movement was a revival, and I guess a movement led by several well-known preachers. George Whitefield is one. We talked about him last week. Jonathan Edwards is another one, who were very charismatic preachers that had these huge revivals, gatherings. Their primary focus was Christian piety, personal piety, more like. Their primary focus was all about personal piety and salvation of individuals. That was a shift from, again, the established churches, because, again, by that time in England, they were more worried about, well, whether you believe this or that, just stay loyal to the church. In the Catholic Church also, it was more of, well, follow the established rules and follow what the church is saying. So rather than a denominational or a focus on the church body, the first Great Awakening movement was a revival that centered and focused on personal piety. And that is a movement that's going to create some changes in history. The second Great Awakening movement happened later on in the 18th century, and that was after the American Revolution, and that was due to, again, the expansion as America was coming to terms of what it means to be its own independent nation, and then expanding out into the frontiers, right? And during that time, Methodism primarily had a large influence and a large push because of the structures in Methodism that allowed it to really grow and work and connect. Again, the focus was still on personal piety, but then that personal piety was practiced through the development of these class meetings or these small group ministries. And all of that, a big part of that had to do with, again, John Wesley back in England started his Methodist movement out of his little holy club, right? So forming these little groups and having them focus on, their spiritual disciplines, their personal piety, that continued. But the structure of having these small groups in these small little towns, and then sending a minister on a horseback, circuit riders, right, to these small towns was effective. Essentially, what it did was also give the reins of leading those groups to the people, because the minister couldn't always be in those small groups, right? So again, it was a focus towards you have to take ownership of your own faith. You're not going to have the big church looming over you. You're not going to have this established church telling you. Each group had to kind of know how to sustain itself. There was a structure that was the Methodist structure, and maybe once a month you get this preacher that comes around to serve communion, to preach, and then to serve communion, right? So it was this movement towards, again, personal piety and this focus on your own spiritual growth. The third Great Awakening movement happens again. So the second Great Awakening goes from latter 18th century to early or mid 19th century. Right around that time, what's happening in the mid 19th century, 1800s? Something big in America, right? Civil War. Civil War is in 1860s, right? I wasn't around, so you guys weren't around either. Okay, all right. But what began clashing, or what started brewing around that time, was this growing concern that again, that movement towards personal piety was not addressing the needs of society. And again, with the brewing, the conflict with the Civil War had to do with, again, the issue of slavery. Right? And so at that time, there were two major push that was going on, and basically there were a group of Christians or Christian thought that felt that the main purpose of the church was to continue preaching the gospel to bring people to Christ for their own personal salvation. Okay, and sometimes we call that the evangelical push, and that was on the one hand. On the other hand, there was a growing concern among more of the progressive churches that said, in order to bring people to Christ, we're going to have to deal with some of the ills of society. Okay? You can't have these struggles of people living in, especially as they went into the frontiers and all of that, living in sin, dealing with some of the societal struggles, and just talk about personal salvation. And so that is what kind of led to this, challenge between personal piety versus social reform. That gave the growth, or that started to lead into this push for this concern for the well-being of society, especially the poor, especially those in the working class. And this was not something that just came out of nowhere. This was something that was already brewing or developing back in England. And a lot of that has to do with, again, by the 1850s, the largest denomination in America was the Methodist Church. And you go back to the Methodist movement and the Methodist history in England, the way that John Wesley kind of reached out and connected with the people was the fact that it wasn't the traditional, I'm going to serve my Anglican church and preach from the pulpit in the sanctuary. He started to go out, right? Again, his good friend George Whitefield, who was one of the major drivers of the first awakening movement, was one that invited him and told him, start preaching in the fields and in the coal mines, because there's plenty of people needing to hear the gospel, and they're hungering to hear the gospel. Well, all of that during the latter 18th century, right, and the 1750s forward, had to do with a response to what was happening in terms of history, the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution started to create some of this rift. Okay, so there's a lot of history here, right? You have to kind of go back to your history class that's like, oh man, I fell asleep in that. Yeah. Right? What was happening? The Industrial Revolution created this chasm. The rich got richer, the poor got poorer. Oh, that sounds familiar too. But John Wesley, back then, he made a very conscious effort during his ministry. He would convert his churches, take out the pews. Again, in fact, in Bristol, there's this new room where he took out the pews and basically converted to infirmaries. Because the needs of the society. There needed to be, there were people who were ill, couldn't go, there was no hospitals, so he converted a lot of his churches to infirmaries during the week. Also, by this time, there was also a huge, and also soup kitchen, right? There was also this huge push. A lot of Methodist churches, but it wasn't just Methodism, a lot of the other denominations, there was this rise in Sunday school. And this whole rise of Sunday school wasn't to teach religious education. It was to address the fact that you had these kids, right? These kids. What was that? There was that one. Yeah, a bunch of kids working in the factories, right? There was no such thing as education for them. So what Sunday school was all about was teaching basic life skills and literacy. It's not, when we think of Sunday school, we think, okay, come to church and you learn to sing the song Jesus Loves Me, right? It was more than that. It was very much hands-on the needs of community and society. So all of this was happening in England as a movement in response to the Industrial Revolution. Part of all this in this time was that the churches were then, again, because of the early social concerns at that time, by the 1800s, Christian groups in both England and America started to develop these social reform movements. The temperance movement, right? Why was the temperance? You guys, what was the temperance movement about? Drinking too much, right? And a lot of that had to do with the fact that, so coming back to, in England or in Europe with the Industrial Revolution, and by this time, alcohol became widely available, right? In America, it had to do with the people in the frontiers. Alcohol was a way of, I guess, escape. Alcohol was a way of, relaxing. Hey, you just got through fighting with a snake or a bear. I don't know what you do. I have no idea what was in the frontier. It's like, let me, Calgon, get me away, except it was in a bottle. So there was this whole issue with alcoholism, and so the temperance movement was to temper that drinking. And so the churches, a lot of the Christian movement was about preaching or encouraging moral ethics. Temperance movement, public education, promoting public education. That education is not just for the elite or the elect or the select or whatever, but it was available, for everyone. And then, of course, in America as well as in England too, the whole issue with slavery, right, has become a big issue. And so there were the abolitionist movements. That all of these movements were either led or women played a huge role in all of these movements. Hannah More, 1745 to 1833. She was Hannah More. She was in England. She was born in Bristol. She got her education. She actually, so for her, she met with John Wesley, and she became a teacher influence. Her father was a teacher, and for her, actually, she didn't meet John Wesley. She met John Newton. There's a lot of Johns. Do you know who John Newton is? John Newton, what denomination was he? Minister. He wrote that song, Amazing Grace, right? After meeting with John Newton, Anglican, he was an Anglican minister, he convinced her. She was a writer, so she was one, back in those days, women weren't really educated, but her father was a schoolmaster, and so her father ended up just educating her anyhow. And in the process of her learning and educating, she befriended John Newton, who had earlier experiences in the slave trade industry, and told her all these horror stories of slavery. Hannah More became a writer, a playwright as well as a poet. And one of the things that she wrote, where'er to Africa's shores I turn my eyes, horrors of deepest, deadliest guilt arise. I see by more than fancy's mirror shown the burning village and the blazing town. See the dire victim torn from social life. See the sacred infant. Hear the shrieking wife. So you hear, so she started writing these, and her writings became very much proliferated all over England, but it told of the horrors. And John Newton encouraged her to continue to write, to spread the message about the horrors of slavery. Her writings greatly influenced society at that time. But one of the things to really note about what she wrote, whereas John Newton and all the other religious ministers that may have opposed slavery, and again, not all of them opposed slavery. Many of them didn't because it's in the Bible. But those who did would have these theological debates of why maybe slavery was right or wrong. She's not dealing with theology. She's talking about just human suffering, which really connected. Another important woman, Elizabeth Herrick. She's the one that met John Wesley, practiced Methodism, became a school teacher, but she went around all over England telling people, stop buying products made from slaves, especially, what did she, she told people not to buy sweets from the sugars, from the sugar plantations. And she wrote that book, Immediate, not Gradual Abolition, meaning, something such as evil as slavery had to stop now. There was none of this, okay, we'll work on our way to kind of, gradually work, move society away from these practices. She was very adamant about it being immediate. Her work led to some of the emancipation movements in America. So during the second and third awakening movements, women were a huge part of these social reforms that's happening. It said that by 1900, women made up 55 to 70% of church attendance. We thought, it's disproportionate now. It was really disproportionate back then. The problem was, you had these women, and now, granted, a lot of them, as they were called and were very pious in their faith, when they got called to, they were convicted, like they need to do something about it. There was no formal structure. Where would they serve? How would they serve? Okay, they were called to serve, but there was no place for women in the church structure. Why? Because churches were run by, So what did the women do? Well, they said that, because there was no formal structure to officially serve in the church hierarchy, they got creative. Right? Now, it wasn't always like this, right? So like in the Catholic Church, there was the order of nuns that they could kind of have a place. But the Protestants, there was no place in the Protestant churches. So a lot of these women got creative. And either got creative or just did what they needed to do to fulfill their calling to serve. And a lot of them, some of them just defied their male counterparts and preached and did whatever they wanted. But for the most part, they did things that were less within the structure of the church. Like they did Bible studies at home, right? They had prayer meetings, at home. Things that they had control over, their home. They did these, and that's and again, if you think about it, that whole Methodist movement of church class meetings, it just kind of fell in line, right? And so a lot of these women practiced their faith, their calling in volunteer work, in being involved in these society or movements that were outside the church. a lot of the abolitionist movements, teaching Sunday school, and again, Sunday school wasn't about religious education, but was about teaching, just teaching. A lot of them were run by women, tract societies, more reformed societies. One of the societies, that's what they did, was the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And I love this picture. Because what they would do, they were a bit aggressive. Apparently they would stand outside of bars and pubs singing hymns and praying for people to have the strength to resist the temptations of alcohol. And even when pub owners or whatever would throw all kinds of garbage on them, they just continued. Frances Willard was, I don't know if she was the first president, but she was one of the most influential leaders of the women's Christian temperance movement, because she lobbied. And she organized that group to really seek out reform in these areas. 8-hour days, prison reform, women's suffrage, all of that stuff is some of the work that the Temperance Movement Union worked on. And again, for her, a lot of these women had that, they were all Methodists, because half of all Protestants here were Methodists at that time. She talks about her convictions in John Wesley's the delicate balance of personal piety and social justice, right? And that's what John Wesley always talks about, right? Having that personal piety, personal spiritual discipline to practice your spiritual disciplines, but living out our Christian faith in the trenches of the world. And so she was a very influential person. The Women's Christian Temperance Union ended up basically they not only they were involved in a lot of these reform movements here in America, but it then it grew into a world movement. And so I believe the WCTU changed its name afterwards to become the World's Christian Temperance Union. And the movement there was then to start dispatching these women to these different countries. What do you call in the church when you send? It then shifted into missionary work. And a lot of these missionary work from 1861 to 1894, they said that 33 denominations developed these women's missionary societies. What is the major women's society that we have, that we know of? Well, United Women in Faith, which was the United Methodist Women, which was the Women's Society, which was originally called Women's Foreign Missionary. There was something about foreign and missionary. Original purpose was missionary. Well, it still is missionary work.
But also to WSCS, the Women's Society of Christian Service.
Yes, but that's one of the rendition changes, right? Oh, Women's Foreign Missionary Society. That was the name back in the 1860 something. Exactly. So, again, yes, our United Methodist Women or United Women of Faith is a separate organization. It's separate from the church. Why? Because the church were run by men and created their structures in a male-oriented, and so these women's movements were outside the church. And so, again, the UMW, it was separate. Now, by 1861 to 1894, 33 denominations. Now, again, at that time, we didn't have the 15,000 denominations that you have now. But still, a lot of the major denominations in America created their own women's societies primarily for missionary work. And these, and originally, it says by 1920s, there were over 3 million missionaries from these women's societies. That's a lot. Now, the thing was, majority of the work that they did was set up hospitals and schools. Why? Because, again, still within the church, there was this, growing concerns about, sending women to foreign countries. You didn't send single women to foreign countries, right? And so a lot of them had to get married, and they went with their husbands. Later on, single women did go to on these missionaries, but when they also got to the foreign countries or places of mission or ministry, there was also this image of women should not be preaching. Women shouldn't be preaching. They also shouldn't be engaged in aggressive evangelism work. Okay, sure. And so they did what they had to do, which was nursing, teaching, right? And in many ways, it became an advantage in these foreign countries because these foreign countries weren't always, again, you're talking foreign countries that were not Christian countries. They're not always keen on some foreign religion coming in. But they're very open to people working to help. And especially when you have some of the more conservative nations where you don't have men treating women, right, in terms of health care. So the women treated women, right? You didn't have men teaching a group of women in classrooms and things of that sort. You had women doing that. So because they were women, they were able to connect with the women in the communities well. Plus, they would not only connect with them, but then not only while they were treating them, teaching them, they would also share the gospel, to share the faith. And from there, the local women would then start small groups or Bible study groups, invite the missionary over to share more. So those were the tactics the strategies that spread throughout the early 1900s, early 20th century, all throughout, when the missionary movements grew. Before I get into feminist theology. So, again, what was also happening by the 1920s, by the way, is so within the church, as these women's groups were really growing and sending out these missionaries and doing incredible work throughout the world, in the church, well, who's left behind when all the women are doing all the work, right? They say that in the church, there was this growing concern by the hierarchy in the church that felt that these women societies were rogue, and so they needed to rein them in. And so there was a movement to bring all of these women societies or women groups under the umbrella of the general ministries within the church. The UMW, or it wasn't the UMW at that time, the women's societies back then still continued to run separately and still is considered separate, but a lot of them started to get reined in. A lot of this, that mentality or that sentiment came from, again, theologically based, the debate of whether women should have the right to preach. Still is. Exactly. This debate, like we said, it continues on. By the I don't have a slide. I don't know where the slide went. By the 1960s, this concern or this theological debate of how the churches are structured, starts to get really addressed by the development of feminist theology. Okay. So what is feminist theology? Feminist theology, in a nutshell, was developed in 1960s to reconsider the traditions and the practices and the understanding of Scripture from a feminist perspective. Feminist theology, in a nutshell, is about a new perspective. It's about recognizing that the structures of the church and much of the theologies in religion have been developed by men. In male-centric societies, thoughts by men, written for men from a male perspective, right? It's almost like our Constitution, right? Well, how does our Constitution say? We the people. Yada 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 yada. Yeah. Anyhow, again, I was thinking for a different phrase in there. Something about by men, or it's written by the people, for the people, of the people, right? Well, much of the church theology is by men, of men, for men, right? And so feminist theology, the first part of feminist theology is to recognize that that is the case, right? To stop denying the fact that the way traditional theology has been interpreted and applies to all. That's the first thing that feminist theology strives to recognize, is that, no, we have a very, our theologies are slanted towards a male-centric or androcentric mentality. Rosemary Rutherford, there's three feminist theologians who are pretty much the most prominent. Mary Daly, Rosemary Radford Rutherford. She was actually one of my professors at Claremont, and Elizabeth Johnson is the other one. I think they all, well, I don't know Rosemary, but Mary Daly and Elizabeth Johnson are part of the Catholic Church. And so, but they did a lot of work in bringing this to the forefront of what does it mean to look at, reconsider our theologies, not from the male perspective, but from a different perspective. And Rosemary Rutherford said this, the critical principle of feminist theology is the promotion of the full humanity of women. Theologically speaking, whatever diminishes or denies the full humanity of women must be presumed not to reflect the divine or an authentic relationship to the divine, or to reflect the authentic nature of things, or to be the message or work of the authentic Redeemer or a community of redemption. Okay. I know, she's a theologian. What does that mean? In other words, what she's talking about is don't assume that we know the authentic experience of the other, right? Because when we talk about, first of all, in feminist theology, it focuses on the experience of God, experience of theology practiced. And what Rosemary Radford Rutherford is saying is, don't assume that you know how theology is experienced by the other. Right? In communication, same thing. Sometimes we assume that the other person hears us, the way we think we are speaking. But that's not always true, right? So one of the first assumptions of, axioms, I don't know, of feminist theology is to not assume that one size fits all in terms of theology. She also writes, a theology based on women's experience and praxis must be by necessity acknowledge and learn to value difference. Okay, so it values difference. A theology based on an understanding of women's experience praxis, which is sensitive to racial, class, and sexual differences, even among women. So just because it's feminist theology, there is no one feminist theology, because every woman will have a different. In fact, there is what is known as womanist theology. Now, how is a feminist theology different than womanist theology? Well, again, the acknowledgement is that as these three women are some of the forefront thinkers for feminist theology, each of them acknowledge that they are white women in mainline Protestant, or not Protestant, mainline church, right? Rosemary is Protestant, but then the other two are Catholic. Womanist theology acknowledges that the experience of African American women is different than white women, and therefore their experience is different. Now, when we say experience, what are we talking about? Experience of what? Experience of God. Experience in society. Experience of life. How does our faith gets practiced in life is going to be different. So feminist theology, again, the primary focus is to understand that no one thinking can be assumed to apply to the other. Okay? So it's more than just male and female. It started there to say that, women have a different perspective than men, but it's more than that. Okay? But again, so in other words, feminist theology resists the temptation to generalize people of class, race, all the different categories. Now, there are two areas that feminist theology tends to really focus on. One is understanding of God, the characteristics of God. What is the problem with our understanding of God?
All the pronouns are he.
You get that? Did you notice that? It's like, oh, wow! That all the pronouns that we use are male, he, him, right? And okay, so Jesus called God Father, so we say that, well, we call God Father because Jesus did. Well, okay, but that's also, Jesus lived in a very patriarchal society, in a very patriarchal culture of Judaism, right? So again, taking that account, when we think of God and even the attributes that we lay upon or we attribute to God, what are they? What are the three classic attributes of God? Omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, right? All-powerful, all-knowing, everywhere. Huh? Yes. That's a very, very male-centric thinking. All-powerful, right? There's almost like a physical strength to that attribute. And so some of the debates is, well, if God is all powerful, then why does all these things happen? Well, a lot of that debate comes from the fact that we are thinking that God is male, right? Even omniscient, all-knowing, as if God is this overlord, watch, whatever, just watching over us, right? As this big brother. Now, we never call it big sister, do we? Right? It's big brother, or God is watching over us, or knows everything. And again, omnipresent, same thing. So we have this male image that kind of influences how we understand who God is. Right? What revelation comes if we start, when we say, what revelation comes from calling God she? What are some of the attributes? Nurturing, caring, compassionate. Okay, yeah, Jesus did that too. What else? What is the other big attribute besides omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent? God is love, right? Okay, that's in the Bible, right? That is, again, but our concept of God loving is this agape love that just surrounds us or almost like does a bear hug to us. Well, that's still male. What is a feminine understanding of love? When there's struggle, when a person is struggling, or a community or an individual experiences deep loss or deep tragedy, we can blame God by saying, well, if God's all powerful, where's God? Right? If God knew that was going to happen, why didn't God prevent it? Right? Well, does God even care? Was God even there, omnipresent, right? A lot of that comes from that, again, characteristics of God. But take that aside and start thinking, okay, what if we viewed God, or we called God she? What is a way, and how would we understand, or what revelation comes from a feminine attribute? Where is God in the midst of pain and suffering? From a motherly, what does mom do when she comforts? Whereas, I get this image. I remember when I was a kid, and I would play outside, and I would do something that a teenage boy would do, and come home with scratches and bruises. And my dad would be like, just put a Band-Aid on. Suck it up. But my mom, right? Yes, she would, put ointment and all of that.
But she's forgiving.
But she didn't say suck it up. She sat there and held me. Right? And there are times when it wasn't physical pain, but it was emotional pain. And my dad would say, well, okay, he's the military colonel, right? Suck it up. But my mom would cry with me. Have we ever thought of God crying with us? Right? That's a feminine attribute. And sometimes that is some of the theology that has come about from feminist theology, is the fact that sometimes when we hurt, God, not sometimes, all the time, when we hurt, God hurts with us. That's a feminist theology understanding. That God, sometimes we say, oh yeah, God came in the form of Jesus so that God can understand humanity. That's a male way of saying, God knows what we're going through. Really? Feminist theology actually gets to the empathy of God hurts with us. It's not about what is God doing to fix this. That's a male way of thinking, right? Fix it. But a feminist way of thinking is God listens to us. God hurts with us. And God experiences the life with us. It's a different way of viewing God as part of all that is around us, and not one that just has control, control, control.
Jesus wept.
And Jesus wept. Right. And again, one of those passages that a lot of times people just like to brush over, right? Yeah, but there's so many aspects of viewing or looking at our faith and who God is, that what feminist theology does is try to, again, it doesn't tell us this is what you're supposed to believe in feminist theology. It's one that encourages us to view, and what does it mean, or how does it resonate with you? Okay, because again, it recognizes that every person has a different experience of God. The other aspects, and it's not necessarily feminist theology, but part of this feminist theology development has brought upon, again, we're on the same timeline, 1960s, has been, again, the voice, that women have a voice, that understanding faith from a feminist theology has a voice. Elizabeth Johnson, that last part in that question, what revelation comes from calling God she? Well, the mystery, right? That you don't have to have the answers. Yeah. And again, all of this is something that we kind of learned for the past 50 years, since feminist theology has kind of helped encourage us to think beyond the traditional way of saying, God is this, God works this way, God has all this in control, to a more acceptance of an experience that it's undefinable, that God is mystery. That's what Elizabeth Johnson is, her key thing is the mystery of God. Keeping it open to everyone's experience. Going back, one last thing, and I don't have a slide for this because I realize, I'm on my last slide. Oh, I do have a slide. No, I don't. No, I don't. Is the whole debate about the ordination of women. Again, the voice of women. Around the same time, in the 1960s, is when this whole thing, again, prior to that, women were involved in every single aspect of the church without the official office. And so since the 1960s, or actually long before that, has always been a debate, but in the 60s, it has come to the forefront, primarily in the Protestant churches. The Catholic Church still doesn't ordain women. But in the Protestant church, the main lines have kind of started ordaining women since the 1960s. One of the largest churches in Southern California, Saddleback. This was on the news not too long ago, like a month ago, 2 months ago. Saddleback is Rick Warren. He wrote the book, The Purpose-Driven Life, right, which was a bestseller and all of that. It's a Southern Baptist church, even though a lot of people, some people know it, a lot of people don't because it's not in the title. It's Saddleback Church. Rick Warren, who started that church back in, I think 1990 or something, he's retired now, but while or on his way out retiring, he passed the baton to several folks, and he ordained. Okay, Baptist church, he can ordain. And he ordained 3 women on the way out. He retired, last year? Yeah, I think last year. Well, SBC, the Southern Baptist Convention, again, the Southern Baptist Church is actually kind of funny because they're a hybrid. They're autonomous. Every church is autonomous, and yet they're connected by, that's what they call it, the convention. They're not like the Methodist Church where we have a clear hierarchy and a connection system. Every church is autonomous, and yet they all kind of agree to operate under the same theology or practices. And one of the practice is, Rick Warren ordaining women is a no-no. And so a couple weeks ago, or about a month ago, the Southern Baptist Convention voted and kicked out Saddleback. It's like a 30,000 member church. And they kicked them out. So Saddleback is no longer Southern Baptist because of the issue of ordination of women. Rick Warren, given credit, he stood up and says, no, they have the gifts. The lead pastor is male, but then the lead pastor, his wife, said, she's a better preacher than I am. And so then has encouraged the three women that Rick Warren ordained to preach and lead the church. So they're kind of branching out. But there's a lot of churches. You know. One of the Methodist is one of those where we have other struggles, but at least the ordination of women, we're like, we're done. Yeah, it's like when I was in seminary, there were more female seminarians than male seminarians. Way smarter than any of us. So, but again, this is a continual movement. Some say that feminist theology is a form of liberation theology. But I think some feminist theology says, well, again, don't put them in a category because it's all about understanding the true variety and the different perspective, and resisting the assumption, the temptation to assume that my experience is your experience. All right? Oh.
I think what we could say is that historically the root is the social gospel.
Yes. They all go back to the social gospel. And again, the social gospel, it's this trend that the church went from traditional organization-centric, the church has to be this way, to, personal piety, So moving from the church to individual, and then from the individual recognizing a need for reform. And again, it's still tied to the salvation of the individual, but the salvation of the individual, again, the social gospel was that you have to change the circumstance of a person before they can fully accept or come to a faith that makes sense for them. And the feminist theology kind of takes that even further to recognize that because every person's experience and struggles are individual, you cannot just put people in a box, and you cannot put God in a box. That's the good one. It is a good one.
But even you have female rabbis nowadays.
Yep. Judaism. So, yeah. When you actually Google feminist theology, there's not the same, but there is a common trend, and it's in different religious traditions as well. That women, this understanding, but it all, again, that they're not all the same, but they all acknowledge this sense of viewing faith or theology, not just Christian theology, but any religious theology, from a different perspective.
But you had to have that because social structure has changed, and we have women who are CEOs of companies. We have women.
Yes.
Women, so.
True. Exactly. So now it's like the chicken or the egg, right? Which came first? Did the thinking shift, which led to societal change, or did society change and therefore it's influencing theology? In seminary, I learned, and Rosemary Rutherford used that term, praxis. It's like, what is praxis, right? Well, praxis is the process of, in seminary we call it, we theologize, right? We learn, ideas. Okay, this is how God works, or this is blah blah blah, and then we put it into practice. And then from practice, we realize, oh yeah, that was bad thinking, and so then we re-theologize. And so the concept of praxis is the interchange of theologize, put it into practice, re-theologize based upon the practice, and then put that into practice and go back and forth. That's how I view my faith. I come up with, it's like, I think this is how God is calling me or asking, nudging me, or this is what I believe about God. And then I try to put it in practice and realize, that was, no. Rethink that. But it's this constant relationship dynamic, rather than to say, God is this, and therefore I need to do this because God is that. It's not one way, it's both directions.
And that's what a faith journey is.
That's why we call it faith journey. And as a faithful Claremont student, process. All right? All right. So next week we will close the series with Dr. Bill sharing with us this whole branch of theology called liberation theology. And again, I'll let him talk about it, but it's bigger than just 1960s forward. It goes way, yeah. So, all right. Thank you for coming out.